Hello and welcome to part 2 of your lesson as to why the First Crusade was called by Pope Urban II. Last time we focused in on the call from the east, so we focused in on the problems that the Byzantine Empire had faced, the expansion of the Islamic caliphates, and the appeal of Jerusalem for Christians. Today it's going to be focused in on specifically Pope Urban II and his motivations behind why he might have called this particular crusade and why it might have been beneficial to him. Now, that will hopefully at the end of this give us the ability to make an overall judgment on that question of why was the First Crusade called. And remember that this is part of a chronological study, so it's not necessarily something that we will have a question specifically on, but we'll start to look more at essay questions next year. So it's important that we keep the notes on this so that we've got that record. And like I say, if you've got the capacity to, please buy those books, particularly Byram and Riley's The Crusades, and the Edexcel A book, Conquest, Control and Resistance in the Medieval World, which is by Davis, Taylor and Blair. That would be useful as well for you to have a copy of. So last time we focused in on the three reasons that pertain to the issue of the call from the east. Now we're going to be looking at the reasons behind the push from the west, so the political ambitions of Pope Urban II, this theory of just war, and the political infighting that was taking place in Europe in the 11th century. And we said that we don't really like to categorise interpretations into school of thoughts, and historians don't really like to be pigeonholed into certain categories. But this idea of this push from the west is something that's been proposed by historians such as Thomas Masneck, people like Jonathan Riley Smith as well, and essentially it can be summarised as this: that Pope Urban II called for the crusade because of internal matters that he believed in as an individual and that was surrounding him in Western Europe, and that the prolonged warfare, the schisms in the 11th century meant that healing was needed, and the way in which they could heal and unify internally was by finding a common enemy, and in this case being the Islamic caliphates, and the target being Jerusalem. So this push from the West school of thought, I'd again like you to take notes based on the three different points, and I've given you a copy of this particular mind map, which is really focused in on the mindset of Pope Urban II, the person that makes this particular decision. Now, we did say last time that the previous Pope, Pope Gregory VII, was potentially thinking about calling a crusade as well in the 1070s. He didn't ultimately, but this wasn't just Pope Urban II's idea. What I want you to think about with these three different factors is that they're not mutually exclusive, they're interchangeable, they're all feeding into Pope Urban II's decision. And it could be the case that the trigger was Emperor Alexius I's call for help to free the lands of Anatolia from the Seljuk Turks. So don't think of these three factors, the theory of just war, the ambitions of the Pope in the 11th century in fighting in Europe, as separate points. They're all feeding into the same issue, which is Pope Urban II. So the order in which I'm talking about these particular points, again, is interchangeable. So firstly, we're going to be looking at the context of Urban's succession to becoming Pope. Now, in terms of the idea of a Pope, we know today that the Pope is God's representative on earth, or supposedly God's representative on earth, depending on how you're viewing that. But if we're going back before the 11th century, what the Pope did and how the Pope was perceived was very different. It's not exactly the same. But we know that in the 11th century, there are a lot of movements that are taking place within the church, the Western church, which are starting to make the Pope become more powerful, or feel as though he needs to become more powerful. So from roughly about 1040, leading clergymen are setting about this challenge of trying to rid Europe of violence and sins, and we've already studied that when we looked at the reforms of Archbishop Lanfranc and Archbishop Anselm of Bec, when we were looking at William I and William II and Henry I. And this reform movement is really it really starts to take off in the 1070s, and we can perhaps say that the reason before that is down to one individual. It's Pope Gregory VII. He's very, very different to his predecessors in his approach to his dealings with the various monarchs of Europe, and this idea that he wants to unify Europe as a whole. Now, we can call these reforms to the church, this term, Gregorian reforms, or we can call them as part of a wider movement, which I'll talk about later, which is called the peace movement. The most significant of these Gregorian reforms wasn't things like simony or trying to challenge the actions of individual bishops. It lay in this controversy called the lay investiture contest, which we've already studied when we looked at William II. And it was this idea that the king of each particular land was able to choose the senior archbishops and bishops and appointed them, and they had to swear loyalty to him. Now, Pope Gregory VII wanted to change that. He wanted the Pope instead to be able to decide who these individuals, these archbishops, should be, and he wanted a greater degree of control on that. So you can start maybe to see the Pope trying to act a bit more like a monarch. Now, this obviously caused a lot of problems, and we know with William II that this caused a bit of a debate, as it did with Henry I, and it rumbles on for a number of years. It isn't just something that Pope Gregory VII has to deal with. But one of the people that really resisted this particular reform was Emperor Henry IV of Germany. Now, I'm saying Germany in a very loose sense because Germany doesn't exist as a country. So we might actually probably be better to say that it's Emperor Henry IV of the Germanic lands. It's also called the Holy Roman Empire, but it's not really holy and it's not Roman, so it's quite difficult to get your head around. But if you are interested, find out a little bit more about Henry IV. We will talk about him later as well. But essentially, it's one of the key figures in Europe that is unhappy with these reforms that Pope Gregory has made. Now, at this time, when Pope Gregory VII is really pushing for these reforms, he has a very, very important advisor, and that is the future Pope Urban II. So Pope Urban II was a close advisor to Gregory VII. He was closely aligned with his particular views, and that gives us an understanding as to why, perhaps in 1095, he wants to maybe unify the Western Church and find a common enemy. And it's not just this, because Pope Urban II becomes Pope in 1088. It's 3 years after the death of Gregory. There's time that needs to be taken before they elect Urban II. And we know as well that from his background, he's actually from this area of France where church reform is centralised. So this is where most of the ideas are taking place by individuals like Anselm of Bec are influenced by this place of Cluny. And we also call them Cluniac reforms. So if you ever see that word, it's all essentially the same thing. And the Cluniac reforms also influenced Urban II. So what he wanted wasn't just to reform the church and rid it of evil and try and increase the power of the Pope, make him more like a monarch. He also wanted to protect those from harm and to try and reduce the amount of fighting that was taking place in Europe. And there was 2 different reforms that the people of Cluny came up with. The first is Peace of God, which was to protect vulnerable people from physical harm, so children, women, and the Truce of God, which is to prevent violence occurring on certain dates of a year, or potentially on a weekend, or specific calendar dates when there were certain saint days. Now, we've called them Cluniac reforms, we've called them Gregorian reforms. We can also call them part of the peace movement. And essentially what he's wanting peace in Europe. Not necessarily peace across everywhere else in the world, but peace in Europe. We know as well that Urban was an advocate of this because a year after he becomes Pope, he urges Christians to settle and build a town in Spain on the border between Christian and Muslim lands. And he said to them that this would amount to a penance for past sins. So if they built this, if they settled there, then they would be absolved of all their past sins. So far, in our particular study, we can see that Urban has a very clear ideology. He has a very clear idea about how he wants the church in Western Europe to look. He wants it to be peaceful. He wants it to be centred around the Pope. And he wants the crucial figures within Western Europe, so the kings, the lords, to look to Pope Urban II as almost like a senior monarch. Pope Urban II is also influenced by this growing idea that that actually it shouldn't just be the Western Church. It should be the Western and Eastern churches. And we said in our previous video that the Byzantine Empire had split from the Western Roman Empire, and so had the Christian Church. So the way in which they conducted their services had caused a bit of a debate. And for a while now, we've seen this schism, this split between the East and the Western Christian Church. So in Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul, the same place, they have a different way of conducting the Mass, different way of conducting church services. We call that liturgy. And in the Western Church, we know that they had a different way as well. Now, Pope Urban II wants to unify not just Western Europe, but Western and Eastern Europe together. And again, there's plenty of evidence to suggest this. The fact that he accepted the envoys, the messengers of Emperor Alexius I in 1095 so welcomingly, and his actions during the First Crusade really suggest that he wants this unification to take place. So a crusade could therefore give Urban that opportunity to link these two churches, and there is evidence to suggest that Pope Urban II was thinking this when he was calling the First Crusade. The three major pieces of evidence are that, according to one chronicler's account of that November speech that he makes in 1095, it's Fulcher of Chartres' account, Urban emphasises the ties between Christians in the West and the East. He wants it to be known that they have far more similarities than they do differences. In 1098, at the Council of Bari, so that's where there's a major meeting involving lots of important archbishops and leaders of the Western Church, he talks about the reunion of the two churches. That is recorded as well. And finally, during the First Crusade, the Pope's leading messenger or legate, someone called Adhemar, he arrives in one particular city called Antioch, and when they capture that particular city, he says, actually, we should return it to the control of the Eastern bishops rather than the Western bishops. And that was seen as quite a conciliatory or peaceful act, a way in which they could try and mediate the two sides, so hopefully they would unify together. Ultimately, it doesn't succeed, but we're looking for the causes of Pope Urban II's decision to call this crusade, and certainly this argument is convincing. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that he wants this link. He wants to keep peace within Europe itself, and he wants to continue the Gregorian reforms from the 1070s. Next, we're going to be looking at what was going on in Europe then. We've talked about this infighting. So what do we mean by infighting? Which sides does it mainly pertain to? Now, you've already got a lot of information about what was going on in England, and you know that from the 1060s, 1070s, 1080s, we have lots of conflict between individuals in England and Scotland, and also within England itself. And that also contributes to this general idea that there might be infighting, there might be problems that are emerging. We know as well that by 1095 William II is King of England. We know that he's not necessarily, he doesn't have necessarily the best relationship with the Pope, likewise doesn't have the best relationship with Archbishop Anselm. That contributes to this idea that the major monarchs aren't listening to the Pope. It's also in the case of Emperor Henry IV of the Germanic lands that he does not have a healthy relationship with the Pope, and particularly Pope Gregory VII. Henry, when he was told about these Gregorian reforms, he was so unhappy that what he tried to do was try and appoint a rival pope or an anti-pope. He'd sent troops to try and take Rome. He was unsuccessful, and he'd fought with lots of armies that were loyal to the Pope, so including Matilda of Tuscany. By 1095, however, Urban II has the upper hand over Henry IV of Germany. And the reason why is because Henry has made some very questionable decisions. His son has betrayed him and has undermined his position, so there's fighting within the family in that sense. And there's also allegations of sexual depravity from Henry IV's second wife of Praxedis, and you can see her coat of arms on the right, Praxedis of Kiev. And Urban, amazingly, even allowed Praxedis to separate from Henry. So Henry IV is in a really weak position by 1095. And in 1095, Henry submits to Urban. Henry almost calls an end to the problems that have plagued this Germanic lands and Rome for the past 20 or so years. And it's not a coincidence that in the same year Henry submits to Urban, it's the same year that there's this call for the First Crusade. Clearly there is a link between the two. It's a perfect time to make a show of united strength, solidify this new tie by finding a common enemy and fighting together. And it's not just in Germany that we see problems in 1095. King Philip I of France, he'd also resisted Gregorian reforms, but by the 1095 as well, he's in scandal. He's essentially had to separate from his wife, partly because he wanted to marry this Bertrada of Montfort, a new wife, but unfortunately for Philip, and unfortunately for the French court and its prestige, Bertrada of Montfort was actually married already. She was married to the Count of Anjou, which is a senior figure in France. So this caused a huge scandal. And in 1095, after a few years of deliberating, Urban II excommunicates Philip I of France. Excommunication means that he essentially says that he will be going to hell. His soul cannot be saved. And that again is the same year as the call for the First Crusade. Now, lots of the people that end up flocking to this idea of the First Crusade are from France. They're major French noblemen, and perhaps it's because they wanted to rally around a new monarch, a new figurehead, and fight a worthwhile cause, rather than going to their French king, King Philip I, and the problems that he's caused. Now, Jonathan Riley Smith is the historian that really concentrates on this view. He believes that this is the main reason why the First Crusade was called. So Riley Smith says that, and I'm paraphrasing here, this isn't the exact wording, but I've tried to summarise the points, that at a time when the Germanic lands were divided over Henry IV, and at a time when the French lands were divided over Philip I, Urban II filled the void for many by acting as a temporal ruler. Now, by temporal ruler, what I'm essentially saying is that he is a king. He's not just a spiritual ruler. He's somebody that is acting like a monarch. So for many of these senior lords and counts and major figureheads across northern Europe, Urban II is somebody that has a clear ideology. He's morally sound. There's no issues with him. And he's also got a clear idea. So Urban's actions were groundbreaking. He seized this particular opportunity in 1095, and he is perhaps the reason why there is such a successful call up to this crusading cause. So far we've seen, this argument starting to develop. We've also got to go a little bit back now, and not just look at the 1070s, 80s, and 90s, but look at how the church tried to justify this idea of going into a conflict or going into war, because without this idea in the back of Urban II's mind, he wouldn't have been able to call a crusade in the first place. So the religious text of the Bible has been collated over centuries, if not by now millennia, and we would roughly say that by the 4th century there's a general consensus about what the Bible's teachings are. But because there's so many different scriptures, and because there's an Old Testament, because there's borrowing of ideas from the Torah, so the Jewish text, it's not necessarily as clear-cut to say these are the teachings of Christianity. And what we start to see from the 4th century AD is that lots of concepts and ideas and teachings start to be shaped by people that are studying the texts or are advising senior Christian figures of these particular texts. And those changes, those amendments, those ideas, those alterings, they're serving political, spiritual, and in some cases even economic purposes for Christian leaders. Now, if we take one particular component of Christianity, which comes from the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, it's very clear that a pope can't call a war, because he would be directly breaking one of the main tenets of Christianity, this thou shalt not kill. So if Urban's to launch a crusade, he needs to amend his perspective of Christ and amend his perspective of the teachings of God. And this is important as well, because he needs to be able to confidently and justifiably say to himself and to other people that this is a just war, that this is a war that is justified. So what Urban does is he speaks to Countess Matilda of Tuscany. I've mentioned her Previously, she's somebody that has helped in terms of forces to try and protect Rome. And he says, I need you to do a job for me. I need you to provide justification for a war. Now, this is before 1095. So clearly this idea is in his mind, that he wants to be able to justifiably say that a war should take place. It's not the first time that a pope has asked this. It's not the first time that a religious leader has asked for justification for a war. But critically, we know that Urban asked Matilda, so clearly he's thinking about it. I mean, we know, for example, that Gregory VII, he justifies the invasion of William I into England. It's not completely new. What Matilda does, though, is she gathers together canonists, so these are people who study Christian scripture and law, and particularly one canonist, a person called Anselm of Lucca, not the same Anselm of Beck that we've studied before. And this is about developing this idea of penitential warfare. Now, it's a difficult concept to try and get our head around, but it's quite crucial. A penitential warfare or penitential war is a war that's fought as a penance or as a punishment to make up for sins committed in the past. So if somebody went on a war, it could actually justify them perhaps going to heaven. It would be able to absolve them of any past sins that they have just made. And this isn't a new idea. This is something that they're developing from individuals that are writing, all the way back to 400 AD. So people like Augustine of Hippo, who's a North African canonist. And this idea that they could potentially launch a crusade, launch a just war, had to meet three criteria. The first was that there was a good reason to fight the war. Secondly, that it had good intentions. And thirdly, that it had an official leader. If those particular criteria were met, then canonists would be able to say that this was a just war, and it would be a penitential war, so something that would be able to absolve people of any past sins that they've made. So let's take this first crusade then. Was there a good reason? Well, in the eyes of the Pope, the Holy Land was Christ's legacy to the Church. It being part of the Roman Empire in the past, they were just retaking what was once theirs. The Islamic caliphates hadn't appeared really until the 7th century. Theirs is a relatively new religion, so they're taking back what was theirs. So, point number one, there is a good reason in Urban's mind to do this. Secondly, did it have good intentions? Well, yeah, they're going to Jerusalem. They would be the same as pilgrims, and it would allow more pilgrimages to take place, and that would give people the opportunity to atone for their sins and make that crucial, most important pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So yes, in Urban's mind, it had good intentions. Finally, did it have an official leader, or will it have an official leader? Yes, the Pope is the person that's calling this particular crusade. They are God's representative on earth, so what they're doing and what they're saying is the work of God. And because they're starting to see themselves more as a papal monarch, they can actually take over control of lots of different individuals. So hopefully there will be real unity and structure. And remember as well, it isn't just Pope that's said these points. It's canonists, it's Matilda of Tuscany, it's Anselm of Lucca, it's Augustine of Hippo saying it from 400 AD. He's utilising the work of others before him. But what we do need to think is this a reason for the call of the crusade, or are these just points of justification? Are these actual motivations or things that Urban just uses himself to justify the call for this particular crusade and to call it for other people? Perhaps it doesn't necessarily answer our question to the full extent of the previous points that we've made. The final thing that I just want to add is something that I've mentioned already, and I just want to reiterate that at the same time as this just war theory is starting to re-emerge and canonists are starting to look back at it and provide justification, there is this other theory that's really taken off in the 11th century. It takes major hold in about the 1020s around Cluny, is this peace of God and truce of God movement. This is part of this overall peace movement. So that's just another thing to add to this just war argument. So there's only one question really to ask of you at the very end of this particular talk, and hopefully if you've been watching, I've been able to make it as clear as I possibly can. You can obviously do your own research, I would recommend that. But now looking at both interpretations, which do you find more convincing, the call from the east or the push from the west? How would you summarise the decision to call the First Crusade? So when you're submitting your work for this particular one, I want your decision, and I'm going to mark those particular decisions. It's not going to be marked according to like a 20 marker. It doesn't have to be particularly long, but I'd say as a minimum I would like half a page on this. And what we're trying to do as well is to prepare you for your coursework. We're looking and engaging with interpretations, trying to forge our own interpretations as well. Thanks very much for watching, and if you've got any questions, just drop me an email.